Hey guys, welcome to this session's Ivy Faith Stories. So I have with me another member of the Ivy community, and that's Ruth. And Ruth, apologies, I did not check with you beforehand how to pronounce your surname, and I don't want to.
So in an anglicized accent, it's Akinradewo, but it's originally from Nigeria, so Akinradewo would be the pronunciation in a Nigerian accent. But I just say Akinradewo because I was born and raised in Manchester, so yeah, I don't expect people to say it in the Nigerian way.
Okay, let me have a go, okay, and forgive me in advance if I. So Ruth Akinradewo.
Excellent, got it first
Yeah,
time.
anglicized version. I'll stick with that one. Ruth, it's great to have you on, Ruth. And so I know you've given me a bit of background information, but actually maybe we'll just go straight into you introducing yourself. So tell me a little bit about how long you've been at Ivy, which service you go to.
So I joined Ivy in August. In August, we just had the evening services, really. We didn't have the Sunday morning services. So I started going to Ivy Didsbury when the morning services began, but I go to an academy grow group. So I kind of get the best of both worlds in the sense that I'm a fairly young person, so it's nice to be part of academy and have people that are around my age that I can grow in faith with. But then I also love the multi-generational aspect of Ivy Didsbury and getting to know like people older than me, people around my age, people younger, kids. So yeah.
That's great. Awesome. So you've been at Ivy since August. And what's been your experience of being part of the Ivy community over the last 10 months or so?
I found it very welcoming for the most part. I love that there's diversity in terms of you've got loads of different races that are not just kind of in their own bubbles, but intermingle and appreciate each other. Obviously it'd be nice to see more of that, but generally, yeah, I feel very welcomed. And I really enjoyed Ivy Central as well as like the Sunday morning services. Obviously we're in lockdown now, but yeah.
With what I think the two big things that are happening in the world right now, one is the pandemic, and the second is, the racial injustice that has really come to light and it's really kind of gripped the world. And, it's caused so many voices to be speaking up from all sides. We're seeing it just all over the media and all over the news. And you yourself, having read a little bit about your background before, you've going to be really active in that battle against racism in your past. So maybe start with your background and your experience, and then we can lead into what you're currently noticing, like with what's going on today.
Yeah. Well, I'd say that I'm a hater of injustice. So it's not just racism that I'm very active in speaking up against. But that's something that I've been speaking up about for a long time, largely because I have direct experience of it. And so I feel like I can amplify that voice because there's direct experience behind it. So I was 9 years old when I first realized that people could hate me because of the color of my skin. So the second school I went to was in Knutsford, a white upper middle class town. I was the first black kid, the only black kid in the school in 101 years. It was founded in 1904 and I joined in 2005, and there were people that had never seen a black person, and a lot of people made me know that I wasn't welcome there, including parents and teachers as well as students. So that's when I first kind of realized, okay, this is a thing. Even though I was born and raised in Manchester, a very diverse area, I went to Brownies and Guides, where there were black, mixed race, Asian kids, and we all got along fine. And, obviously you see color and you see that you look different, but it doesn't matter when you're a child. I always say that racism is taught and it has to be unlearned. So I went to Oxford University, and that is a really institutionally racist place to be in, and it's still having huge issues today. Sadly, it doesn't seem that much has changed at all. But in my time there, I was part of a decolonization movement called Rhodes Must Fall. We got vilified a lot by the national press, who did not really understand what we were doing. But essentially, we wanted to make Oxford University a place where everybody felt that they could belong. And we lived in a place that was celebrating and adulating former colonialists, former apartheid creators and founders, and not making any apologies for it. And we said, this isn't okay. That's just one example. We also tried to speak into the education there and how it was very colonized. All the scholars, generally the scholars that we studied, were all white Europeans. There was no space created for African scholars or other people of color, and there are many in the academic world. So those are just some examples. I also wrote for The Voice, a national newspaper, like a Black British newspaper here in the UK, about racism in Oxford on a number of occasions, because there's just a lot that goes on there that is not okay. So yeah, those are just a few examples of the stuff that I've done specifically on racism.
Mm. And I think that, that I'd love to hear your perspective on this, because, as I mentioned, I think what happened with George Floyd, it almost, and in my words, and other people might say it differently, it's like the straw that kind of broke the camel's back, is that it wasn't something that's new. It was something that somehow, I don't know, like everything came together and it just really came to light. And I think it would, and then for you though, your journey started way before that incident, right? Before that hit the news. You've been partitioning for and fighting for this, as you mentioned, for many years and during your university time. So what was it like for you? What was your response and your reaction when you saw this kind of really surface over the last few weeks?
Something I have to keep saying is that this is not new. People of color live with this reality every day. We live with the reality of being racially profiled, of people, if I can speak specifically into the Black experience, people feeling threatened by us because we're confident and assertive, for example. There's this stereotype of the angry Black woman. I can give you an example of just me talking as I am now and using my hands and speaking with confidence and hopefully some kind of clarity, and people flinching like I'm going to hit them or something. And it's like, why should my assertiveness be seen as aggressiveness? That's something that needs to change. And it doesn't just start with the murder of George Floyd. Like, that's just symptomatic of a much more deep-seated issue that's very long-standing. And I'm really glad that people are opening their eyes up to this reality now and speaking up about it. But I think it's a real shame that it's taken this long. And when something like this happens, when something like the death of the murder of George Floyd happens and the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, etc., happens, for Black people, we already carry a collective trauma just because we're Black people, because we are people that were treated as property, that in America were considered 3/5 of a human being. We already carry that trauma of how, for generations upon generations, we've not been seen as human beings. And then you add to that our own personal experience of racism, which I don't have time to go into all my experiences of racism. I mean, growing up in Manchester and then going to the school in Knutsford and then living abroad, living in France and Italy in particular was really, really horrible for me, having this skin tone. So anytime something like this happens, specifically for a Black person, it's traumatic. It's not just like a sad news story and then we just scroll past and forget about it. It's like, this person was murdered because they have the same color of skin that I do, and that color of skin is seen to be something that legitimizes that person's dehumanization. And that is, yeah, it's really painful, and it's been a tough few weeks, to be honest. I'm getting over onto the other side now, hopefully, but there's a lot of despair, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of anger that this keeps happening, righteous anger, like this is not right, this is not just. But I'm hoping that things are going to start changing now, because I can't not hope, because if I don't, it's just depressing. So I'm really glad that conversations are beginning. I think that dialogue is really, really important in moving forward, and also trying to switch off the apathy that many people have had prior to this, just like being, oh, it's the problem of Black and brown people, like I don't need to bother, like, or I don't see it, therefore it doesn't exist, which is something that a lot of people of color can relate to. So I'm glad that people are listening and that conversations are beginning.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think that people can not see what's going on right now. So, as you said, apathy, it's going to be switched off. They can't ignore what's really right front and center of every time you just turn on your phone and turn on the TV, go to a news channel. So with that said, then has this what's happening over the last few weeks really, I guess, is the significance of it, like, it giving you a hope or optimism that there is a new momentum now, there is a shift happening?
I'd like to think so. Honestly, I'd like to think so, because as I said earlier, it's depressing if I don't think so. But it does become very difficult, and I've had this discussion with many of my Black friends and family, to believe that it will get better, because we've been thinking that it would get better for so long, and we're looking at the timeline and thinking, but this was happening in the 80s, this was happening in the 90s, this is still happening. And George Floyd, again, is symptomatic of a greater issue. So obviously I'm still alive, thank God, but the stereotyping that makes people think that I'm threatening, or makes people push me on the metro, as happened to me in Italy, because they didn't want to be around a Black person, or the fear that makes somebody move to the other side of the metro because a Black person sat next to them on the tram, that is all building up to that moment, because it's making people feel like this person is not worthy of being on the same level as me. And so I think, actually, especially as the church, it's our job to re-educate and help unlearn some of those sometimes unconscious biases that people have that can lead to a moment like that.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And what would you like to see that would be, for you, progress, I guess, in the immediate, short, middle term to this?
Progress is complex. I think if we talk about racism just as a systemic issue, it's something that you find in the housing sector, it's something that you find in the education sector, in the workplace, just generally in society. So progress would look like seeing things change in each of those sectors. For example, history books don't typically include people of colour. If we look at the UK curriculum, when we study British history, it's all about how great Britain is and how we won the wars, yay, and just like how Britain is so awesome. But there's no mention of colonization. There's no mention of people of colour that fought in the wars. There's no mention of how people were brought over from the Caribbean, for example, to help the NHS. So I think a lot of it is rooted in education, as one example, because if we start to learn that history is not take history as at face value, and start to make room for other narratives, I think that would be some measure of progress.
Okay, so start filling in the gaps with historical records, which then feed into the education system.
Yeah, that's just general. Sorry.
Giving people a more holistic view and a more accurate representation of what's gone on in the past.
Yeah, I think that's general progress. But speaking specifically into the church, I think creating an environment where everybody feels like they belong, and where all cultural expressions are welcome and celebrated, is another measure of progress.
Sure, sure. And where do you think that would start?
Oh, Andy, you ask hard questions.
They give the best answers, the hard questions. And this is just an evolving conversation, right? It's not, nothing is set in stone. We are really just, on one hand, just kind of spitballing ideas back and forth. And that's what this is. It's an ongoing and evolving conversation and discussion. Just bashing ideas around is all.
Yeah. Well, I gave the example the other day of how if we want our church to not just be diverse but also be inclusive, we could make room for, say, different types of worship styles, gospel, African, Caribbean, whatever, just or like when we have hospitality, to have different food shared and that kind of thing, to make everybody feel like, okay, my culture is welcome here, like I can bring this to the table and it's not going to be seen as weird. Or that's just one example.
Sure. Okay, great. Thanks, Ruth. Is there anything else that you kind of, want to say that that's been on your mind regarding this and what's happening with regards to the racial injustice and all the protesting, the campaigning that's happening across the world?
Well, I'm glad that that there's a unity of voices. I'm glad that it's not just something that people have looked at as America's problem, but now people are starting to look internally and say, okay, maybe we have a problem here too. I suppose maybe the pandemic is part of the reason that it's reached this level of attention, because many people have more time on their hands. I do want to say something about how the pandemic is affecting certain people more adversely than other people. And that is, so I'm a Press Red ambassador, and Press Red is a Christian charity that works to raise awareness about gender-based violence, so violence against women and girls. And we're seeing a huge spike in cases of domestic abuse at the moment because, of course, people are locked down in their homes. And it's harder for abused women to access the refuges or access support because their violent partners, and it's not just physical violence, so we're talking about also emotional and financial and loads of different forms of abuse, but because their partners are with them, it's much more difficult for them to seek support. So I think please pray for these women and sometimes children as well that are facing these really difficult times, but also for the people that are trying to provide support for them. And I think that now is a time more than ever for us to be thinking about injustice and thinking about trying to help those that are not as well off as we are, and not just talking monetarily, but just in terms of what they go through day to day.
Sure, absolutely. And let's talk a little bit more about that, and so people can get a better understanding and maybe even like know how to potentially help out. So how has that's one of the things I think is a blind spot for many people, right? They don't consider the fact that when we're during lockdown, we're safer at home, but not for everyone. Especially the people that you're talking about, women, children suffering from abuse and all forms of abuse, not just physical. So there's the invisible side of things that you don't know. You can look at somebody from the outside and you think everything's fine and dandy, but you don't know what goes on within those four walls of their home. And how has Press Red, or maybe you in your role, adjusted the way that you help and support in this situation? Has that been difficult, or have you been still able to provide that support?
Well, if we weren't in lockdown, I would be speaking at churches, possibly traveling a bit further afield. Obviously, we can't do that right now, but I write blog posts for Press Red to try and raise awareness in that way. and try and have conversations with people to get people to think about these issues as well. But a key way to support is to donate to Press Red if you have anything to spare, because Press Red has a lot of different initiatives to try and help educate businesses, for example, churches, to spot the signs of abuse. Domestic abuse is just one of many different forms of gender-based violence. There are others like FGM. Breast ironing is something that not many people know about. That happens in the UK as well.
What was that, sorry?
Breast ironing is a really, really horrible form of abuse against young girls that kind of originates in Africa, West Africa, and is found here as well. So there are lots of different forms of gender-based violence that we try and raise awareness about. And so if you do have any money to spare, we want to kind of position ourselves to better educate people. We actually have a course going on at the moment, which we're doing in line with Elaine Storkey, to try and help people spot signs as well and do something about them.
Okay, great. And so you've been a volunteer for Press Red for how long?
Since June of last year, so not that long. But I used to volunteer at a domestic abuse refuge, and abuse is something that's quite close to my heart as a subject. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. And so with all that you're doing, what else do you fill your time with? Or does that take up most of your your schedule?
Well, I studied French and Italian at uni, so at the moment I'm actually tutoring in French and English, not Italian. So that's what I'm doing as my job at the moment, because I don't have a full-time job at the minute. I actually had the coronavirus earlier this year.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, I had it really badly. So I'm not like doing a full-time job at the moment.
Oh, wow.
I have to prioritize my health, but.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I love to worship. I like to write songs. I love to read. I write a lot. I write for my blog. I write for other blogs. Yeah, those are a few things I enjoy doing.
so many passions.
Yeah.
A lot of creativity in there being expressed. And what is your like aim? Like, what happens after lockdown? What's your kind of long-term plans with what you're doing at the moment? Do you have like a sense of clear direction in front of you?
Excuse me. I believe I'm called to worship leading, so that's something that that I try and prioritize, I suppose. I also, I've had people say to me, because I am so passionate about injustice, that maybe it's something that I'm supposed to do. I mean, I'm doing it in my own little corner as much as I can, like speaking to people and writing and having conversations and whatever. But yeah, I don't know. See what God has planned. I don't know.
It's part of the excitement, isn't it? Seeing what God has planned.
Yeah. But I think for me, I guess songwriting, worshiping, and writing are like my main passions. So something with those, I guess.
Great, lovely, love it. You mentioned, and I didn't know this before. You mentioned that you had coronavirus earlier this year. Is it okay if I ask like what it was like for you personally? What that experience was like? Because I've heard and read, many people who have had it, they have varied experiences with it. What was it like for you?
It was horrible, Andy. I've never been so ill. I already have a long-term condition, so that made me more vulnerable. the government guidelines changed just about the time that I realized I had the coronavirus. So I actually didn't know that I was high risk. So I was just kind of following whatever they said, like wash your hands for 20 seconds and, stay at a reasonable distance from people that seem ill. And that was all that they were saying at the time. So I wasn't extra precautious. And cautious. I don't even know if precautious is the word. Anyway, so
it is now.
Yeah. So I realized I had the coronavirus, and it all happened very quickly. On the day I realized I had the virus, a friend of mine lost her mum to the virus, and then that kind of put everything into perspective for me, because I was doing a job at the time that was really, really taking its toll on my health. As I said, I already have a long-term condition, so the stress and the overload of work really took its toll, not just on my physical health, but my mental, my emotional, my spiritual well-being. And I literally decided that morning, after praying about it and talking with a friend, that I was going to quit that job. And then a few hours later, I came down with the coronavirus. So it was good timing that I quit my job, because I definitely couldn't do it at that time, because I became very delirious. I got a really, really high temperature. I don't have a thermometer, but I guess I was about 41, 42 degrees. I was dripping with sweat. I turned red. Yes, I'm black, but I turned red. And yeah, I actually live on my own. I live in a flat on my own. And so that was difficult, because nobody could take care of me, because of course, if anybody came over, they would also get the virus. So I think it's kind of a blessing in disguise, because I didn't want anybody else to get it. But because the condition I have is a chronic pain condition, so that the pain intensified loads because of the coronavirus. And then I was a lot weaker as a result as well. So simple things like going to the kitchen to make myself some breakfast or dinner, I couldn't do, because I couldn't get out of bed. So because I wasn't eating enough, I was getting more ill, because I wasn't getting the vitamins that I needed and everything. So yeah, my breathing got really bad. The breathing was the worst part, but there were loads of other symptoms that I did not enjoy. And paramedics came round a couple of times. It's literally a miracle. Basically, it's a miracle, because one of the paramedics that came over said the way you're breathing was like, it doesn't get better after that. It gets progressively worse. But hey, I'm standing it or sitting
here
today to say, like, yeah, I made it. But a lot of people were praying for me, and yeah, I honestly, I thought I was going to heaven, but I'm still going to heaven, just not today. But yeah, I think it definitely made me more passionate about sharing my faith with people. I have friends that call me an evangelism junkie. I just
great nickname.
Yeah,
I love that.
I used to run after people, because the church that I used to go to, that I grew up in, when we did evangelism on Saturdays, I would literally run after people to tell them that Jesus loved. When I was like 7 years old, I'd like run after people. So I think it's made me even more passionate, because it's like at this time, people are really fearful. People are in search of hope. They want answers, and we don't have all the answers because we're Christians, but we do have the peace that Jesus brings. And so I think more than anything, now's the time to share our faith with people and give them hope.
100%. And we've heard this, we've heard the stories, like when the church has left the building, the church is online, and we're seeing so many people coming to faith, praying for the first time, asking the bigger questions, because when something like the coronavirus hits you, like you just shared, it's a life-threatening disease, virus, and so people are, starting to question, well, what's really important here? And it's just so good. And then there's people like you who are chasing people down and going, Jesus loves you, giving them that option. It's fantastic. That's great, Ruth. Thank you so much. I don't have any kind of further questions. is there anything that you would like to talk about or go into a little bit more depth with regards to what we've already covered?
I think I just want to close by saying this, based on everything that we've discussed in terms of injustice. We are all created in the image of God. That's it.
Mm-hmm. That's it.
We're all worthy of dignity and respect because we're created in the image of God. So it doesn't matter what differences people have to us. God looked at that person and said, he is good, she is good. And we have no right to treat them with anything less than the dignity and the respect that God gives them.
Amen. Thank you so much for your time. It's really great to connect this way, really great to hear your story and all the different things that you've been doing. And I clearly can see that God is doing the work in you, you know, even though you suffered that really tough time with the coronavirus, it's clear that God is not done with you yet. So thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you, Andy.